From ancient kingdoms to a global powerhouse, the story of South Korea is truly epic. It all starts thousands of years ago with legendary beginnings, leading to the rise of powerful dynasties like Goguryeo, Baekje, and Silla, which unified the peninsula. Fast forward through the Goguryeo and Joseon eras, which gave us things like Celadon pottery and the Hangul alphabet. The 20th century brought immense challenges, including Japanese colonization and the heart-wrenching Korean War, which divided the nation. But from the ashes rose the miracle on the Han River. In just a few decades, South Korea transformed itself from a war-torn country into a leading global economy, a vibrant democracy, and a cultural giant with K-pop and K-dramas loved worldwide. What an incredible journey of resilience and innovation! If you're fascinated by stories like this, hit that subscribe button and join us for more adventures through history. Thanks for watching. The history of South Korea begins with the Japanese surrender on 2 September 1945. At that time, South Korea and North Korea were divided, despite being the same people and on the same peninsula. In 1950, the Korean War broke out. North Korea overran South Korea until U.S.-led UN forces intervened. At the end of the war in 1953, the border between South and North remained largely similar. Tensions between the two sides continued. South Korea alternated between dictatorship and liberal democracy. It underwent substantial economic development. South Korea, officially the Republic of Korea, ROK, is a country in East Asia. It constitutes the southern half of the Korean peninsula and borders North Korea along the Korean demilitarized zone, with the Yellow Sea to the west and the Sea of Japan to the east. Like North Korea, South Korea claims to be the sole legitimate government of the entire peninsula and adjacent islands. It has a population of about 52 million, of which half live in the Seoul metropolitan area, the 9th most populous metropolitan area in the world. Other major cities include Busan, Daegu, and Incheon. The Korean peninsula was inhabited as early as the Lower Paleolithic period. Its first kingdom was noted in Chinese records in the early 7th century BC. From the mid-1st century BC, various polities consolidated into the rival kingdoms of Goguryeo, Baekje, and Silla. The latter eventually unified most of the peninsula for the first time in the late 7th century AD, while Baekje succeeded Goguryeo in the north. The Goguryeo Dynasty, 918 to 1392, achieved lasting unification and established the basis for the modern Korean identity. The subsequent Joseon Dynasty, 1392-1897, generated cultural, economic, and scientific achievements and also established isolationism, starting from the mid-17th century. The succeeding Korean Empire, 1897-1910, sought modernization and reform, but was annexed in 1910 into the Empire of Japan. Japanese rule ended following Japan's surrender in World War II, after which Korea was divided into two zones, the Soviet-occupied Northern Zone and the United States-occupied Southern Zone. After negotiations on reunification failed, the Southern Zone became the Republic of Korea in August 1948, while the Northern Zone became the Communist Democratic People's Republic of Korea the following month. In 1950, a North Korean invasion triggered the Korean War, one of the first major proxy conflicts of the Cold War, which saw extensive fighting involving the American-led United Nations Command and the Soviet-backed People's Volunteer Army from China. The war ended in 1953 with an armistice and left 3 million Koreans dead and the economy in ruins. Due to the lack of a peace treaty, the Korean conflict is still ongoing. South Korea endured a series of dictatorships punctuated by coups, revolutions, and violent uprisings, but also experienced a soaring economy and one of the fastest rises in average GDP per capita, leading to its emergence as one of the 4 Asian tigers. The June democratic struggle of 1987 ended authoritarian rule and led to the establishment of the current 6th Republic. South Korea is now considered among the most advanced democracies in continental and East Asia. Under the 1987 Constitution, it maintains a unitary presidential republic with a popularly elected unicameral legislature, the National Assembly. South Korea is a major non-NATO ally of the United States and is regarded as a regional power in East Asia and an emerging power in global affairs. Its conscription-based armed forces are ranked as one of the strongest in the world and have the second highest number of military and paramilitary personnel. A highly developed country, South Korea's economy is ranked 14th largest in the world by nominal GDP and PPP-adjusted GDP. It is the world's 11th largest exporter and 7th largest importer. South Korea performs well in metrics of education, human development, democratic governance, and innovation. It has one of the world's longest life expectancies, though its population is aging rapidly and has the lowest fertility rate in the world. South Korea has some of the fastest internet connection speeds and densest high-speed railway networks. Since the turn of the 21st century, the country has been renowned for its globally influential pop culture, particularly in music, TV dramas, and cinema, a phenomenon referred to as the Korean Wave. South Korea is a member of the OECD's Development Assistance Committee, the G20, the IPEF, and the Paris Club. U.S. Military Administration, 1945-1948, Emperor Hirohito announced the surrender of the Empire of Japan to the Allied powers on 15 August 1945. General Order No. 1 for the surrender of Japan, prepared by the Joint Chiefs of Staff of U.S. military forces, and approved on 17 August 1945, prescribed separate surrender procedures for Japanese forces in Korea north and south of the 38th parallel. After Japan's surrender to the Allies, formalized on 2 September 1945, division at the 38th parallel marked the beginning of Soviet and U.S. occupation of the North and South, respectively. This division was meant to be temporary, to be replaced by a trusteeship of the United States, United Kingdom, Soviet Union, and Republic of China, which would prepare for Korean independence. The trusteeship had been discussed at the Yalta Conference in February 1945. U.S. forces landed at Incheon on 8 September 1945 and established a military government shortly thereafter. Lieutenant General John R. Hodge, their commander, took charge of the government. Faced with mounting popular discontent in October 1945, Hodge established the Korean Advisory Council. The Provisional Government of the Republic of Korea, which had operated from China, sent a delegation with 3 interpreters to Hodge, but he refused to meet with them. Likewise, Hodge refused to recognize the newly formed People's Republic of Korea and its People's Committees and outlawed it on 12th of December. A year later, an interim legislature and interim government were established, headed by Kim Kyu-shik and Syngman Rhee, respectively. Political and economic chaos, arising from a variety of causes, plagued the country in this period. The after effects of the Japanese exploitation remained in the South, as in the North. In addition, the U.S. military was largely unprepared for the challenge of administering the country, arriving with little knowledge of the language, culture, or political situation. Thus, many of their policies had unintended destabilizing effects. Waves of refugees from North Korea and returnees from abroad added to the turmoil. In December 1945, a conference convened in Moscow to discuss the future of Korea. A 5-year trusteeship was discussed, and a U.S.-Soviet Joint Commission was established. The commission met intermittently in Seoul, but deadlocked over the issue of establishing a national government. In September 1947, with no solution in sight, the United States submitted the Korean question to the UN General Assembly. The resolution from the UN General Assembly called for a UN-supervised general election in Korea, but after the North rejected this proposition, a general election for a constitutional assembly took place in the South only in May 1948. A constitution was adopted, setting forth a presidential form of government and specifying a 4-year term for the presidency. According to the provisions of the Constitution, An indirect presidential election took place in July. Ri Syngman, as head of the new assembly, assumed the presidency and proclaimed the Republic of Korea, South Korea, on 15 August 1948. On 15 August 1948, the Republic of Korea was formally established, with Syngman Rhee as the first president. With the establishment of Rhee's government, de jure sovereignty also passed into the new government. On 9 September 1948, a communist government, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea, was proclaimed under Kim Il-sung. However, on 12 December 1948, by its Resolution 195 in the Third General Assembly, the United Nations recognized the Republic of Korea as the sole legal government of Korea. In 1946, the North implemented land reforms by confiscating private property, Japanese and pro-Japanese owned facilities and factories, and placing them under state ownership. Demand for land reform in the South grew strong, and it was eventually enacted in June 1949. Koreans with large land holdings were obliged to divest most of their land. Approximately 40% of total farm households became small landowners. However, because preemptive rights were given to people who had ties with landowners before liberation, many pro-Japanese groups obtained or retained properties. With the country now divided, the relationship between the two Koreas turned more antagonistic as time passed. The Soviet forces having withdrawn in 1948, North Korea pressured the South to expel the United States forces, but Rhee sought to align his government strongly with America and against both North Korea and Japan. Although talks towards normalization of relations with Japan took place, they achieved little. Meanwhile, the government took in vast sums of American aid, in amounts sometimes near the total size of the national budget. The nationalist government also continued many of the practices of the U.S. military government. In 1948, the Rhee government repressed military uprisings in Jeju, Suncheon, and Yeosu. During the rebellion and its suppression, 14,000 to 60,000 people were killed in all fighting. Of note, President Rhee's regime was intolerant of opposition. A famous event that highlighted this was the arrest and conviction of future President Park Chung-hee for communist conspiracy in 1948. The main policy of the First Republic of South Korea was anti-communism and unification by expanding northward. The South's military was neither sufficiently equipped nor prepared, but the Rhee administration was determined to reunify Korea by military force with aid from the United States. However, in the second parliamentary elections held on 30 May 1950, the majority of seats went to independents who did not endorse this position, confirming the lack of support and the fragile state of the nation. When the Communist Army attacked from the north in June, retreating South Korean forces executed tens of thousands suspected communists or sympathizers, either in prison or in a re-education movement, in what is known as the Bodo League massacre. On 25 June 1950, North Korean forces invaded South Korea. Led by the U.S., a 16-member coalition undertook the first collective action under the United Nations Command, UNC, in defense of South Korea. Oscillating battle lines inflicted a high number of civilian casualties and wrought immense destruction. With the People's Republic of China's entry on behalf of North Korea in late 1950, the fighting came to a stalemate close to the original line of demarcation. Armistice negotiations, initiated in July 1951, finally concluded on 27 July 1953 at Panmunjom, now in the Demilitarized Zone, DMZ. Following the Yaha Armistice, the South Korean government returned to Seoul on the symbolic date of 15 August 1953. After the armistice, South Korea experienced political turmoil under years of autocratic leadership of Syngman Rhee, which was ended by student revolt in 1960. Throughout his rule, Rhee sought to take additional steps to cement his control of government. These began in 1952, when the government was still based in Busan due to the ongoing war. In May of that year, Rhee pushed through constitutional amendments which made the presidency a directly elected position. To do this, He declared martial law, arrested opposing members of parliament, demonstrators, and anti-government groups. Ri was subsequently elected by a wide margin.
Ever wondered how South Korea transformed from a war-torn nation into a global powerhouse in just a few decades? Let's dive into a story of incredible resilience and growth. After the Korean War in the 1950s, South Korea faced immense challenges. But with sheer determination, the country embarked on an ambitious journey of economic development. This period, often called the Miracle on the Han River, saw rapid industrialization, with giants like Samsung and Hyundai leading the charge. But it wasn't just about the economy. The 1980s brought a powerful democratic movement, giving the people a voice and shaping the vibrant, free society we see today. From the ashes of conflict rose a nation known for its cutting-edge technology, captivating K-pop, and world-famous cuisine. It's a truly inspiring story of a nation that never gave up. If you found this interesting, please like this video and subscribe for more amazing stories from around the world. Thanks for watching. Third Republic of Korea. The Third Republic of Korea, Korean, Ja3 Gongwaguk, RR, Jasam Gongwaguk, lit. Third Republic was the government of South Korea from 17th of December 1963 to 23rd November 1972. The Third Republic was founded on the dissolution of the Supreme Council for National Reconstruction that overthrew the Second Republic and established a military government in May 1961. Park Chung-hee, the chairman of the Supreme Council, was elected president of South Korea in the 1963 presidential election. The Third Republic was presented as a return to civilian government under the National Assembly, but in practice was a dictatorship under Park Supreme Council members and the Democratic Republican Party. The Third Republic prioritized South Korea's economic development, anti-communism, and strengthening ties with the United States and Japan. Park was re-elected in the 1967 presidential election, and the National Assembly passed a constitutional amendment to allow him to seek a third term, and he was re-elected in the 1971 presidential election. Park declared a state of emergency in December 1971 and announced plans for Korean reunification in a joint communique with North Korea in July 1972. Park launched the October Restoration in October 1972, declaring martial law, dissolving the National Assembly, and announced plans for a new constitution. The Third Republic was dissolved on approval of the Yushin Constitution in the November 1972 constitutional referendum and replaced with the Fourth Republic of Korea. In May 1961, the Supreme Council for National Reconstruction overthrew the Second Republic of Korea in the May 16th coup, led by Major General Park Chung-hee, in response to its inability to prevent political instability after the overthrow of the First Republic of Korea under President Syngman Rhee in the April Revolution. The Supreme Council established a military junta headed by General Chang Do-yong and the May 16th coup's supporters in the Republic of Korea Army, hoping to kickstart South Korea's economic development that had been ignored for 12 years under the First Republic, and remove so-called liberation aristocrats, the ruling class of conservative politicians involved in the Korean independence movement. Power struggles within the Supreme Council allowed Park to engineer the gradual transfer of power from Chang to himself. In July, Park officially replaced Chang as chairman, effectively becoming the de facto dictator of South Korea. The Supreme Council suspended the National Assembly, reinforced South Korea's anti-communist position, and undertook a number of economy-oriented reforms to help industrialize and develop the country, including the first 5-year plan. The Supreme Council's military government was met with instant disapproval from South Korea's main ally, the United States, and Park's early attempts to appease the Americans were disregarded. By 1962, U.S. President John F. Kennedy and his administration began to pressure Park into restoring democracy and civilian rule in South Korea. On 2 December 1962, a referendum was held for a new constitution with a presidential system of rule, which was allegedly passed with a 78% majority. In response, Park discharged himself from military service in order to be eligible to run as a civilian in the upcoming presidential election, despite he and the other military leaders pledging not to run for office. Park narrowly won the 1963 presidential election from former President Yoon Po-soon, who was president during the May 16th coup. Third Republic, 1963-1972. Park's administration started the Third Republic by announcing the 5-year Economic Development Plan, an export-oriented industrialization policy. Top priority was placed on the growth of a self-reliant economy and modernization. Development first, unification later became the slogan of the times, and the economy grew rapidly with vast improvement in industrial structure, especially in the basic and heavy chemical industries. Capital was needed for such development, so the Park regime used the influx of foreign aid from Japan and the United States to provide loans to export businesses, with preferential treatment in obtaining low-interest bank loans and tax benefits. Cooperating with the government, these businesses would later become the chaebol. Relations with Japan were normalized by the Korea-Japan Treaty ratified in June 1965. This treaty brought Japanese funds in the form of loans and compensation for the damages suffered during the colonial era without an official apology from the Japanese government, sparking much protest across the nation. The government also kept close ties with the United States and continued to receive large amounts of aid. A status of forces agreement was concluded in 1966, clarifying the legal situation of the U.S. forces stationed there. Soon thereafter, Korea joined the Vietnam War, eventually sending a total of 300,000 soldiers from 1964 to 1973 to fight alongside U.S. troops and South Vietnamese armed forces. Economic and technological growth during this period improved the standard of living, which expanded opportunities for education. Workers with higher education were absorbed by the rapidly growing industrial and commercial sectors, and urban population surged. Construction of the Gyeongbu Expressway was completed and linked Seoul to the nation's southeastern region and the port cities of Incheon and Busan. Despite the immense economic growth, however, the standard of living for city laborers and farmers was still low. Laborers were working with low wages to increase the price competitiveness for the export-oriented economy plan, and farmers were in near poverty as the government controlled prices. As the rural economy steadily lost ground and caused dissent among the farmers, however, the government decided to implement measures to increase farm productivity and income by instituting the Sayamal movement, New Village Movement, in 1971. The movement's goal was to improve the quality of rural life, modernize both rural and urban societies, and narrow the income gap between them. Park ran again in the 1967 presidential election, taking 51.4% of the vote. At the time, the presidency was constitutionally limited to 2 terms, but a constitutional amendment was forced through the National Assembly in 1969 to allow him to seek a 3rd term. Major protests and demonstrations against the constitutional amendment broke out, with large support gaining for the opposition leader Kim Dae-jung, but Park was again re-elected in the 1971 presidential election. Parliamentary elections followed shortly after the presidential election, where the opposition party garnered most of the seats, giving them the power to pass constitutional amendments. Park, feeling threatened, declared a state of national emergency on 6 December 1971. In the midst of this domestic insecurity, the Nixon Doctrine had eased tensions among the world superpowers on the international scene, which caused a dilemma for Park, who had justified his regime based on the state policy of anti-communism. In a sudden gesture, the government proclaimed a joint communique for reunification with North Korea on 4 July 1972 and held Red Cross talks in Seoul and Pyongyang. However, there was no change in government policy regarding reunification, and on 17 October 1972, Park declared martial law, dissolving the National Assembly and suspending the Constitution. Fourth Republic, 1972-1981, Fourth Republic of Korea. The Fourth Republic of Korea, Korean, J4 Gongwaguk, RR, Jesa Gongwaguk, lit. Fourth Republic was the government of South Korea from November 1972 to February 1981. The Fourth Republic was founded on the approval of the Yushin Constitution in the 1972 constitutional referendum, codifying the de facto dictatorial powers held by President Park Chung-hee and succeeding the Third Republic. Park and his Democratic Republican Party ruled under the centralized and authoritarian Yushin system until the assassination of Park on 26 October 1979. The Fourth Republic entered a period of political instability under Park's successor, Choi Kyu-ha, and the escalating martial law declared after Park's death. Choi was unofficially overthrown by Chun Do-hwan in the coup d'état of December 12th in December 1979 and began the armed suppression of the Gwangju uprising against martial law. Chun launched the coup d'état of May 17th in May 1980, establishing a military dictatorship under the National Council for Reunification and dissolving the National Assembly, and was elected president by the council in the August 1980 presidential election. The Fourth Republic was dissolved on the adoption of a new constitution in March 1981 and replaced with the Fifth Republic of Korea. The Fourth Republic began with the adoption of the Yushin Constitution on 21 November 1972. This new constitution gave Park effective control over the parliament and the possibility of permanent presidency. The president would be elected through indirect election by an elected body, and the term of presidency was extended to 6 years with no restrictions on reappointment. The legislature and judiciary were controlled by the government, and educational guidelines were under direct surveillance as well. Textbooks supporting the ideology of the military government were authorized by the government, diminishing the responsibilities of the Ministry of Education. Despite social and political unrest, the economy continued to flourish under authoritarian rule with the export-based industrialization policy. The first two, 5-year economic development plans were successful, and the third and fourth 5-year plans focused on expanding the heavy and chemical industries, raising the capability for steel production and oil refining. However, large conglomerate chaebols continuously received preferential treatment and came to dominate the domestic market. As most of the development had come from foreign capital, most of the profit went back to repaying the loans and interest. Students and activists for democracy continued their demonstrations and protests for the abolition of the Yushin system, and in the face of continuing popular unrest, Park's administration promulgated emergency decrees in 1974 and 1975, which led to the jailing of hundreds of dissidents. The protests grew larger and stronger, with politicians, intellectuals, religious leaders, laborers, and farmers all joining in the movement for democracy. In 1978, Park was elected to another term by indirect election, which was met with more demonstrations and protests. The government retaliated by removing the opposition leader Kim Young-sam from the assembly and suppressing the activists with violent means. In 1979, mass anti-government demonstrations occurred nationwide. In the midst of this political turmoil, Park Chung-hee was assassinated by the director of the KCIA, Kim Jae-gyu, thus bringing the 18-year rule of the military regime to an end. Fifth Republic, 1981-1988. Fifth Republic of Korea. The Fifth Republic of Korea, Korean JA5 Gongwaguk, RR, G5 Gongwaguk, lit. Fifth Republic was the government of South Korea from February 1981 to February 1988. The Fifth Republic was established in February 1981 by Chun Do-hwan, a military colleague of longtime president and dictator Park Chung-hee, after the political instability and military rule in the Fourth Republic since the assassination of Park in October 1979. The Fifth Republic was ruled by Chun and the Democratic Justice Party as a de facto dictatorship and one-party state. The Fifth Republic faced growing opposition from the democratization movement of the Gwangju uprising, and the June Democracy Movement of 1987 resulted in the election of Roh Tae-woo in the December 1987 presidential election. 3 days after the election, upon the adoption of a new constitution that laid the foundations for the relatively stable democratic system of the current Sixth Republic of Korea. On 25 February 1988, the Sixth Republic of Korea was established. After the assassination of Park Chung-hee, Prime Minister Choi Kyu-ha took the president's role only to be usurped 6 days later by Major General Chun Do-hwan's 1979 coup d'état of December 12th. In May of the following year, a vocal civil society composed primarily of university students and labor unions led strong protests against authoritarian rule all over the country. Chun Do-hwan declared martial law on 17th of May 1980, and protests escalated. Political opponents Kim Dae-jung and Kim Jong-pil were arrested, and Kim Young-sam was confined to house arrest. On 18th May 1980, A confrontation broke out in the city of Gwangju between protesting students of Cheonam National University and the armed forces dispatched by the Martial Law Command. The incident turned from ancient kingdoms to a global cultural powerhouse. The story of South Korea is a true epic. For centuries, powerful dynasties like Silla, Goguryeo, and Joseon shaped the Korean peninsula, leaving behind a rich legacy of art, science, and philosophy. The 20th century brought immense challenges, including a painful colonial period and the devastating Korean War, which divided the nation. But from the ashes of conflict rose the miracle on the Han River. In just a few decades, South Korea transformed itself into a leading global economy, a vibrant democracy, and the epicenter of the Hallyu wave. From K-pop to cutting-edge technology, its influence is felt worldwide. This incredible journey of resilience and innovation is what makes South Korea's history so inspiring. If you're fascinated by this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more amazing histories. Thanks for watching. First Republic of Korea. The First Republic of Korea, Korean Jaegongwaguk, lit First Republic, was the government of South Korea from August 1948 to June 1960. The First Republic was founded on 15 August 1948, and it became the first independent republican government in Korea. Syngman Rhee was the first president of South Korea. The National Assembly was created following the May 1948 general election, and the National Assembly in Seoul promulgated South Korea's first constitution in July, establishing a presidential system of government. In 1947, the United Nations proposed elections under its supervision to establish a unified Korean government. South Korea participated, leading to the formation of the Republic of Korea. The Soviet civil administration in Northern Korea refused, and North Korea was established separately, which ultimately led to the division. Accordingly, on 12 December 1948, the United Nations recognized the Republic of Korea as the only lawful government in Korea by UN General Assembly Resolution 195. The First Republic claimed sovereignty over all of Korea, but only controlled Korea south of the 38th parallel until the end of the Korean War in 1953, when the border was modified. The First Republic was characterized by Rhee's authoritarianism, limited economic development, strong anti-communism, and by the late 1950s growing political instability and public opposition to Rhee. The April Revolution in April 1960 led to Rhee's resignation and the transition to the Second Republic of Korea. Second Republic of Korea. The Second Republic of Korea, Korean Jaegongwaguk, RR, Jaegongwaguk, lit. Second Republic was the government of South Korea from June 1960 to May 1961. The Second Republic was founded months after the April Revolution mass protests against President Syngman Rhee, succeeding the First Republic and establishing a parliamentary government under President Yoon Po-sun and Prime Minister Chang Myon. The Second Republic ended Rhee's authoritarianism and repression, formed a liberal democracy, and formulated the first 5-year plans to develop the formerly neglected economy. After 13 months, it was overthrown by the South Korean army in the May 16th coup led by Park Chung-hee. The Second Republic was replaced by a provisional military government under the Supreme Council for National Reconstruction, leading to the Third Republic of Korea. The short-lived Second Republic was the only parliamentary government in the history of Korea. The First Republic of Korea had existed since 1948 under President Syngman Rhee, who was widely considered to be a corrupt leader who abused his presidential powers to maintain his rule and cronyism. Although the First Republic was officially a representative democracy, Rhee adopted a strongly anti-communist position and used the threat of communism to enact a policy, such as the National Security Act, of severe repression against all political opposition, effectively assuming dictatorial powers. Tolerance of Rhee and his Liberal Party-dominated government declined in the mid to late 1950s, as the South Korean public were increasingly discontent with the repression and the limited economic and social development. In April 1960, Rhee was overthrown by widespread protests known as the April Revolution in response to the discovery of a high school student murdered by police during demonstrations against Rhee and rigged elections in March. After Rhee's fall, power was briefly held by a caretaker government headed by Ho Chong as prime minister until a parliamentary election was held on 29 July 1960. The Second Republic operated under a parliamentary system, with the Prime Minister of South Korea as the head of government and the President of South Korea as the head of state. Due to Ri's numerous abuses of power, the president's power was greatly reduced, with a role that was largely ceremonial. He was elected by a joint session of the National Assembly with a two-thirds supermajority required to win. Real political power was vested in the Prime Minister, who was nominally elected by the House of Representatives but in practice was the leader of the majority party or coalition in the lower chamber. The Second Republic was the first and only instance of the South Korean government using a parliamentary system instead of a presidential or semi-presidential system. The Democratic Party, which had been in the opposition during the First Republic, easily gained power. Ri's former opponent Chang Myon became prime minister. The new legislature was bicameral, with the House of Representatives as the lower house and the House of Councilors as the upper house. Yoon Po-sun was elected as the second president of South Korea on 13 August 1960. Second Republic, 1960-1963. After the Student Revolution, power was briefly held by an interim administration under the Foreign Minister Heo Jong. A new parliamentary election was held on 29 July 1960. The Democratic Party, which had been in the opposition during the First Republic, easily gained power and the Second Republic was established. The revised constitution dictated the Second Republic to take the form of a parliamentary cabinet system where the president took only a nominal role. This was the first and the only instance South Korea turned to a parliamentary cabinet system instead of a presidential system. The assembly elected Yoon Po-sun as president and Chang Myon as the prime minister and head of government in August 1960. The 2000 demonstrations were held during the 8 months of the Second Republic. Under pressure from the left, the Chang government carried out a series of purges of military and police officials who had been involved in anti-democratic activities or corruption. A special law to this effect was passed on 31 October 1960. 40,000 people were placed under investigation. Of these, more than 2,200 government officials and 4,000 police officers were purged. In addition, the government considered reducing the size of the army by 100,000, although this plan was shelved. Second Republic saw the proliferation of political activity, which had been repressed under the Ri regime. Much of this activity was from leftist and student groups, which had been instrumental in the overthrow of the First Republic. Union membership and activity grew rapidly during the later months of 1960, including the Teachers' Union, Journalists' Union, and the Federation of Korean Trade Union. In economic terms as well, the government was faced with mounting instability. The government formulated a 5-year economic development plan, although it was unable to act on it prior to being overthrown. The Second Republic saw the yuan lose half of its value against the dollar between fall 1960 and spring 1961. Although the government had been established with support of the people, it had failed to implement effective reforms which brought about endless social unrest, political turmoil, and ultimately, the May 16th coup. Military rule, 1961-1963. The May 16th coup, led by Major General Park Chung-hee on 16 May 1961, put an effective end to the Second Republic. Park was one of a group of military leaders who had been pushing for the depoliticization of the military. Dissatisfied with the cleanup measures undertaken by the Second Republic and convinced that the current disoriented state would collapse into communism, they chose to take matters into their own hands. The National Assembly was dissolved and military officers replaced the civilian officials. In May 1961, the junta declared pledges of the revolution, anti-communism, strengthened relations with the United States, an end to government corruption termed fresh and clean morality, a self-reliant economy, working towards reunification, and a return to democratic civilian government within 2 years. As a means to check the opposition, the military authority created the Korean Central Intelligence Agency, KCIA, in June 1961, with Kim Jong-pil, a relative of Park, as its first director. In December 1962, a referendum was held on returning to a presidential system of rule, which was allegedly passed with a 78% majority. Park and the other military leaders pledged not to run for office in the next elections. However, Park became presidential candidate of the new Democratic Republican Party, DRP, which consisted of mainly KCIA officials, ran for president and won the election of 1963 by a narrow margin. Supreme Council for National Reconstruction. The Supreme Council for National Reconstruction, Korean Goguryeo, was the ruling military junta of South Korea from May 1961 to December 1963. The Supreme Council overthrew the Second Republic of Korea in the May 16th coup in May 1961 and established a provisional military government composed largely of officers who were involved in or supportive of the coup. The Supreme Council was headed by the chairman, the de facto head of government with dictatorial powers, while President Yoon Po-sun was retained as a figurehead. The Supreme Council prioritized South Korea's economic development and political stability, suspending the National Assembly and most political freedoms, and founding the Korean Central Intelligence Agency to combat pro-North Korean and other anti-government activity. Park Chung-hee served as chairman of the Supreme Council from July 1961 until his victory in the 1963 South Korean presidential election, and the Supreme Council was dissolved upon the inauguration of the Third Republic of Korea in December 1963. The First Republic of Korea was established on 15 August 1948 following the transfer of power from the United States Army military government in Korea, USAMGIC, to the government of South Korea, becoming the first independent government of South Korea. The First Republic had a highly centralized government under President Syngman Rhee, who maintained autocratic power as the president of South Korea and was widely viewed as authoritarian and corrupt. Rhee's government was characterized by widespread cronyism, intimidation, and indifference to South Korea's economic development. Until the late 1950s, Rhee's unpopularity and corruption was largely tolerated by the South Korea public for the sake of political unity, and as a staunch anti-communist, had crushed open opposition to his regime, using the threat of communism as an excuse. In April 1960, Rhee was eventually overthrown in mass protests known as the April Revolution, started in response to the murder of a student killed by police during earlier protests against election rigging. Rhee's former political opponents in the Democratic Party established the Second Republic of Korea with a new parliamentary system of government and dominated the National Assembly following elections. The Second Republic was led by Chang Myon as Prime Minister of South Korea, a position which held most of the power, and was headed by Yoon Bo-seon as president, now a largely ceremonial role. The new government attempted to fix the issues left behind by Rhee, but proved to be ineffective, and caused the political instability of the First Republic to continue.